God versus Nature, the conflict between religion and science in history. Chapter 7, Galileo versus the Church. The most infamous episode of conflict between science and religion is the case of Galileo's clash with the Church. This was a clash between, on the one hand, the greatest scientist of the early scientific revolution, and, on the other hand, the greatest symbol of religion in Europe. This chapter will present an overview of the events leading up to and including Galileo's trial and punishment. In the final section, we will see how modern historians have turned against the view that this clash was between science and religion. And we will see why they have rejected the most essential point of this story. The Copernican Revolution. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Ptolemaic system was still the foundation for all astronomy. The Muslim astronomers had made improvements to Ptolemy's system, but these were not dramatic changes. No one was ready to radically rethink Ptolemy's Earth-centered system. Early in the 16th century, Polish canon Nicholas Copernicus developed a radically new system of the cosmos, published in his De Revolutionibus in 1543. Inspired in part by the sun-worshipping views of Aristarchus and Pythagoras, Copernicus proposed two new ideas. One, the sun is fixed and unmoving at the center of the universe. Two, the Earth participates in two motions. It rotates on its own axis, and it moves in a circle around the sun. With his proposed system, Copernicus addressed one of the most disturbing mathematical issues that astronomers had with the Ptolemaic system. In order to account for the changes in speed of the planets as they move in their circles, Ptolemy had created an off-center point called the equant, which regulated the speed at which the planet moves. The equant was the point at which the angular rate of change is constant, but beyond this, it has no physical meaning. If the epicycles had seemed physically implausible, the equant was doubly so. By rearranging the motions of the heavenly bodies, Copernicus was able to eliminate Ptolemy's equants completely. Moreover, whereas Ptolemy needed epicycles to explain the retrograde motions of the planets, Copernicus did not. Copernicus did include epicycles in his system, and Kepler was later able to eliminate all epicycles by positing the even more radical notion that celestial bodies move in ellipses, not circles. Copernicus's system had other advantages as well. It explained why Mercury and Venus, unlike the other planets, are always viewed as being close to the sun. Ptolemy's system had no explanation for this. But it was explained by the Copernican system, since the orbits of Mercury and Venus are inside that of the Earth. Ptolemy's system also exhibited another curious pattern. The epicycle motions of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are correlated with the Sun's orbit in such a way that the retrograde motions of these planets always occur when the Sun is on the opposite side of the Earth. This is a striking coincidence in Ptolemy's theory. What does a planet's retrograde motion have to do with the Sun? In the Copernican system, this was easily explained by the fact that these planets have orbits outside that of the Earth. Copernicus circulated his ideas to friends in a manuscript in 1514, but he was reluctant to publish, for fear of persecution. He knew that some would point to biblical passages saying that the Earth was fixed. But the most common objection to Copernicus was, why don't we perceive the Earth's motion? Why do objects thrown up in the air come down in the same spot? If the Earth is rotating with a period of 24 hours, not to mention circling the sun at high speed, then it seems that we should notice that we're moving. We should be continuously buffeted by strong winds. A rock thrown straight up in the air should come down far away, but we don't see anything like this. A further problem with the theory involved a phenomenon known as stellar parallax, which is predicted by Copernicus's theory. Consider what happens when you stand at one goal line of a football field and look towards the opposite end, focusing on the goal post and the bleachers behind it. Now suppose that you walk along the goal line and keep looking across the field. You will see the goalpost shift in position relative to the bleachers. If the Earth is moving in an enormous circle, its orbit, around the Sun, the constellations should look different depending upon where we are in that circle. The problem is that no one was able to measure any such changes. Copernicus explained this result by supposing that the stars are so distant as to make such changes too small to notice. Given the enormous stellar distances required for parallax to be unobservable, this was not a convincing argument for many of his contemporaries. Copernicus's friends urged him to publish his theory, but he postponed this until he was on his deathbed. In 1543, he handed his book, On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, off to the Lutheran theologian Andrew Osiander to handle the publication. Without the knowledge of Copernicus, Osiander added an unsigned foreword, saying that the arguments are not presented, quote, in order to persuade anyone of their truth, but only in order that they may provide a correct basis for calculation, unquote. This made the ideas less potentially offensive. Many astronomers discovered that Copernicus's theory made their calculations much easier, but they did not take it seriously as a literal description of the universe. Accordingly, the Church paid little attention to the theory. In the 1590s, while teaching mathematics at the University of Padua, Galileo became convinced that the Copernican theory was correct, and he informally promoted it to friends and associates. As a result of his experiments in theories of motion, he had developed his concepts of inertia and the relativity of motion. He argued in a thought experiment that if a ship were sailing at a constant speed, then observers in an interior cabin would not be aware of this motion. This answered the main argument against the Copernican theory. We do not perceive the motion of the Earth because we and all of our surroundings are moving with it. Kepler's book, Mystery of the Universe, defended the Copernican system. When, in 1597, Galileo received a copy of this book, he wrote to Kepler, quote, "It is really pitiful that so few seek truth, but this is not the place to mourn over the miseries of our times. I shall read your book with special pleasure, because I have been an adherent of the Copernican system for many years. It explains to me the causes of many appearances of nature which are quite unintelligible within the commonly accepted hypothesis." Unquote. Galileo's first clash with the Church, 1616. In 1609, Galileo learned about a device invented in Holland that made distant objects appear closer. He quickly constructed his own improved design, and as he began directing his telescope at the heavens, he soon found new and dramatic evidence against the Ptolemaic system. First, he discovered that the moon was not the perfect sphere it was supposed to be as a heavenly body. It seemed to have a rugged surface similar to that of the Earth. The following year, Galileo discovered 4 moons of Jupiter, proving that celestial bodies could orbit bodies other than the Earth, which had not been thought possible. With the publication of these results in 1610 in The Starry Messenger, Galileo became famous throughout Europe. Later that year, Galileo discovered that Venus had phases similar to the moon. These phases conclusively disproved the Ptolemaic system, and they provided strong evidence that Venus orbits the Sun. Copernicus held that Venus orbits the Sun, but this was not unique to his system. In 1588, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe proposed a hybrid system, with the Earth unmoving at the center of the universe, the Sun and Moon orbiting the Earth, and the other planets all orbiting the Sun. The Tychonic system became popular with astronomers in the early 17th century because it had the computational advantages of Copernicus together with the religiously acceptable view that Earth is fixed. The troublesome aspect of the Tychonic system was its bizarre asymmetry. Virtually all the planets now orbited a moving point far from the center of the universe. By the time Galileo discovered the phases of Venus, he had believed in the essential truth of the Copernican theory for over a dozen years, but he had only discussed it informally with friends. He had been cautious about promulgating the ideas in wider circles. But now, with the publication of The Starry Messenger, he was a widely esteemed scientist, known throughout Europe. At this time, he had a much more secure position, being in the employ of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He was ready to start openly advocating for his ideas. Galileo wrote his first public defense of Copernicanism in 1613 as a result of a question asked of his student Benedetto Castelli. Castelli had been dining with the Grand Duchess Christina, mother of the Grand Duke of Florence. The Grand Duchess asked if the theory of Copernicus was consistent with the passage in the book of Joshua, where God makes the sun stand still in order to lengthen the day. After Castelli told Galileo about this, Galileo wrote a long letter to the Grand Duchess. In this letter, which was meant for public dissemination, Galileo argued that the Bible should not always be taken literally. Instead, we often need to interpret the Bible in the light of the natural knowledge we possess. In the story of Joshua, it is possible that God may have stopped the earth's motion, not the sun's. From the perspective of those who experienced it, the sun had stood still in the sky. Galileo argued that the Bible has no authority over natural science, which is based on reasoning from observations. These comments were especially controversial in light of the Catholic Church's ongoing counter-reformation. The Council of Trent had resolved that the Bible could not be reinterpreted contrary to the views of the Church Fathers, who were undoubtedly not Copernicans. On hearing about Galileo's letter, a number of academics and churchmen smelled more than a whiff of heresy. In late 1614, a Dominican friar named Tommaso Caccini preached a sermon at Santa Maria Novella in Florence, in which he denounced Galileo in the strongest terms. A few months later, another Dominican, Niccolo Lorini, complained to the Inquisition. Then a fellow Copernican jumped into the controversy. In early 1615, priest Paolo Antonio Foscarini published a book that interpreted the Bible to be compatible with Copernicus. Hearing about the ongoing controversy, Galileo went to Rome in 1616 to argue his case. He wanted to try to persuade the Church to remain open on the question of whether the earth moves. A number of theologians and academics simply refused to look through the telescope, but others were more open to the new ideas. Galileo spoke to bishops, cardinals, and theologians, some of whom were sympathetic to the Copernican system. A key figure in deciding the outcome of this issue was undoubtedly the Holy Inquisitor, Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino. Bellarmino was one of those who, in 1600, had condemned the Copernican Giordano Bruno to death for his unorthodox theological views. Bruno had been convicted of heresy and then burned alive. Bruno was not a scientist, but his cruel fate was a powerful reminder of the power of the Church to stifle views of which it did not approve. On initially hearing about the telescope, Bellarmino had been interested in learning more about science. But when he saw that the new views could cause theological problems, he lost any scientific curiosity he might have had. In February of 1616, the Holy Office of the Inquisition convened a panel of 11 experts to examine the Copernican thesis. They met at the Collegio Romano, where they deliberated for 4 days. On February 24th, they concluded that the theory of Copernicus was formally heretical, with a vote of 11-0. As a result of this recommendation, the Inquisition suspended Copernicus's book, placing it on the Index of Prohibited Books until it had been corrected by church censors. Foscarini's book was condemned, and all copies were to be destroyed. Galileo was summoned to an audience with the Holy Inquisitor. Cardinal Bellarmino ordered Galileo not to hold or defend the Copernican hypothesis in any way whatsoever. Galileo had no choice but to agree. Italy's greatest scientist had been silenced. Since 1610, Galileo had been promising his supporters a book presenting his cosmological views, but now he was forbidden to work on it. The following years were the least productive of Galileo's career. The early 1620s brought 2 events that gave Galileo hope for advancing his views. In 1621, Cardinal Bellarmino died. The Collegio Romano officially commemorated Bellarmino as, quote, the hammer of the heretics, unquote. The engraving on his tomb summed up his life, quote, with force I have subdued the brains of the proud, unquote. In 1623, Galileo's old friend and admirer, Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, was elected pope, taking the title Urban VIII. Barberini had a reputation as an intellectual and had even written a poem for Galileo. Galileo saw a clear sign of hope that he could change the Church's position regarding Copernicus. Meanwhile, Galileo had developed an argument for the Earth's motion that he believed was conclusive. According to this argument, the Earth's tides are caused by the moving of the Earth. It turns out this is not a valid argument, but no one recognized this at the time. In 1624, Galileo made several visits to the new pope, and they discussed the possibility of the Earth's motion. To Galileo's disappointment, the pope insisted that Galileo must not claim the Copernican system to be true. Galileo had no choice but to agree. However, the Pope allowed that Galileo could discuss the theory as a mere hypothesis, providing that he included a certain argument. The argument was that since God is omnipotent, then he could have created the universe in any way he desired, so that any causal mechanisms we suppose to exist are merely hypotheses. Shortly after this meeting, the Pope was heard to have said that the Index's decree against Copernicus may have been a mistake. Encouraged, Galileo returned to Florence and began work on his cosmological work, which he initially titled On the Tides, and later Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernican. It did not directly address Tycho Brahe's system by name, but it included arguments that did address this system. Galileo's second clash with the Church, 1632-33. Galileo submitted his dialogue to the censors of Rome in 1632, where it was approved, subject to a few modifications and subsequently published. Written as an extended dialogue between three men, it was divided into 4 days of discussion. Galileo wrote it as not just a work of science, but also literature. In fact, it was a rhetorical masterpiece. This dialogue contained 3 participants: Simplicio, Sagredo, and Salviati. The name Simplicio was a play on the word for simpleton, and Simplicio was the dialogue's mouthpiece for the Church. In the dialogue, Salviati is the advocate of the Copernican system, Simplicio is the advocate of the Ptolemaic system, and Sagredo is the neutral character who asks questions and is usually won over by Salviati. Simplicio, true to his name, is portrayed as a simple-minded fool. Galileo did include the argument that the Pope had insisted on, but it was on the last page of the book, in the mouth of the simpleton Simplicio. When this fact was pointed out to the Pope, he was furious, telling the Florentine ambassador, "I have been deceived." Galileo had not told the Pope about Bellarmino's 1616 warning, and further had insulted the Pope by putting his words into the mouth of a simpleton. In late 1632, the Holy Inquisition summoned Galileo to Rome. Galileo had clearly disobeyed the order given to him in 1616, but he was not about to confess to this. He argued that he was not presenting heliocentrism as true, but merely as a hypothesis. He admitted that he might have accidentally presented this hypothesis too strongly. The legal case against Galileo focused on the question, did Galileo violate the injunction of Cardinal Bellarmino? The Church's records on Bellarmino's meetings with Galileo had some irregularities, which worked in Galileo's favor. Another factor operating in Galileo's favor was the fact that the Pope wanted the prestige of science. He did not want to appear anti-intellectual and opposed to new discoveries. According to physicist David Harriman, quote, "The Pope was caught in a contradiction. He wanted reason to function, but to remain subservient to faith. He wanted the products of independent thought in order to honor and sanction the Church's authority that opposed such thought. He wanted to claim the prestige of the new science for the glory of the old religion." In 1632, when the dialogue was published, the Church authorities were forced to make a choice. If they wanted to be regarded as enlightened intellectuals, they would have to earn such a reputation by allowing the free exchange of ideas. If they wanted instead to uphold the long-standing rule of faith and force, then they must act openly as enemies of reason. Unquote. Seeking a middle way out, the Inquisition settled on a less severe verdict than simple heresy. They convicted Galileo of, quote, "vehement suspicion of heresy," unquote, which warranted a milder sentence. On June 22, 1633, in a crowded church, Galileo read the following statement. Quote, "After having been judicially instructed with injunction by the Holy Office to abandon completely the false opinion that the sun is the center of the world and does not move, and the earth is not the center of the world and moves, and not to hold, defend, or teach this false doctrine in any way whatever, orally or in writing, and after having been notified that this doctrine is contrary to Holy Scripture, I wrote and published a book in which I treat of this already condemned doctrine and adduce very effective reasons in its favor, without refuting them in any way. Therefore, I have been judged vehemently suspected of heresy, namely of having held and believed that the sun is the center of the world and motionless, and the earth is not the center and moves." Therefore, desiring to remove from the minds of your eminences and every faithful Christian this vehement suspicion, rightly conceived against me, with a sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I abjure, curse, and detest the above-mentioned errors and heresies." Unquote. Rumor has it that, as the trial ended, Galileo muttered, "Nevertheless it moves," under his breath. He probably did not actually say this, but it is clear that he was thinking it. Galileo was sentenced to formal imprisonment for life at the pleasure of the Holy Inquisition. He was later released into the custody of Archbishop Ascanio Piccolomini in Siena, and the sentence was later commuted to perpetual house arrest at Galileo's small farm in Arcetri, near the convent where his daughters lived. He was forbidden to teach, travel, or even to visit his own daughters without permission. He became bitter about the injustice done to him, quote, "under the lying mask of religion," unquote, and he signed his letters, quote, "from my prison in Arcetri," unquote. The Church placed Galileo's dialogue on the Index of Prohibited Books, where it would remain for the next 2 centuries, until 1835. And even then, the Church still did not acknowledge any errors in its handling of Galileo. Finally, in 1979, Pope John Paul II convened a commission to reinvestigate the case of Galileo. The commission lasted 13 years. Then, in 1992, John Paul issued a formal announcement, saying in general terms that errors had been made, and that Galileo's interpretation of Scripture was actually the correct one. As a Los Angeles Times headline declared, quote, "It's official. The earth revolves around the sun, even for the Vatican," unquote. Galileo and modern historians. While modern historians generally report the facts accurately about the historical events of Galileo's fall, they stress one or more of the following points. Using his powerful rhetorical skills, Galileo mercilessly ridiculed his enemies, who ended up reporting him to the Inquisition. The Pope was struggling with political problems, such as his embroilment with the 30 Years' War. He was seen by many as weak, and he needed to demonstrate his assertiveness. The Pope did not convict Galileo of heresy, but only of the lesser charge, vehement suspicion of heresy. Although the inquisitors threatened Galileo with torture, he was never actually physically tortured or locked up in an actual prison. Galileo's primary proof of the Earth's motion based on the tides is invalid. What was the fundamental cause of Galileo's fall? There were many causes, answer the historians, and they are virtually impossible to rank. High on the list, they place Galileo's arrogance and the bad luck of the political situation. They do generally acknowledge that there was a conflict between science and religion here, but they deny the centrality of this conflict. As one historian concludes, quote, "Ultimately, it may turn out that, underlying the apparent conflict between science and religion, the trial of Galileo exhibits the deep structure of nothing less and nothing more than the conflict between conservatism and innovation," unquote. But the central conflict was between science and religion. Galileo may have been a sincere Catholic and had faith in many matters of religious doctrine. But when it came to the Copernican theory, he was fundamentally focused on evidence and logical reasoning. The Church, in censoring the arguments for the Copernican system, was not interested in the truth, but in maintaining its own authority. It is possible that if Galileo had played his cards differently, Perhaps if he had put the Pope's argument in the mouth of the neutral Segredo, he might not have been summoned by the Inquisition, and he might not have been convicted of any crime. But this does not change the basic facts. Galileo was fighting for a view he believed true based on evidence and reasoning, and the Church was blatantly suppressing debate on the subject in order to support a system based fundamentally on faith. Science was clashing with religion, in the most profound sense. The Church widely disseminated its condemnation of Galileo. It then actively encouraged reactionary academics to attack the ideas of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. As a result, numerous such critiques were published in Italy. One of these contained the following argument. Quote, "Angels make Saturn, Jupiter, and the Sun turn around. If the Earth revolves, it must also have been an angel in the center to set it in motion. But only devils live here, so it would therefore be a devil who would input motion to the Earth. It seems, therefore, to be a grievous wrong to place the Earth, which is a sink of impurity, among the heavenly bodies, which are pure and divine things." Unquote. It was now clear to scientists that if they wanted to discuss the new theories of the universe openly, they needed to stay clear of the Catholic Church. The French philosopher René Descartes had been writing a treatise titled The World, which made use of Copernican principles. But on hearing of Galileo's fate, Descartes withdrew his publication plans. During the Renaissance, Italy had been the center of gravity of the intellectual life of Europe, but now this center shifted northward and never returned to Italy. Galileo's conflict with the Church was indeed a conflict between religion and science. Galileo's reliance on evidence and reasoning was implicitly based on the primacy of existence. The Church's reliance on authority and faith was based on the primacy of consciousness, the consciousness of the Church authorities, and ultimately that of God.